share my screen here and get started. So my name is Alicia Halbritter, and I am the Agriculture and Natural Resources Agent in Baker County, Florida, which is just west of Jacksonville. I know we had some people sign up from all across the United States and even some international people. So this presentation is not necessarily going to be exclusive to Florida. A lot of the things we're going to discuss today are basic pasture management topics and techniques that could be applicable all across the country or in a variety of situations, whether you're grazing horses, cattle, sheep, goats, any other livestock species, or even just managing for hay and such like that. If we do talk about some of our herbicides, then a lot of those will be particular to Florida and the research we've done here, as well as the regulations and what's legally allowed in Florida. So make sure if you're out of state or in a particular area that any of that is based on your own regulations and such according to where you are. So the first thing I want to talk about is, my slides will move here, is why do we need to manage pasture weeds? What's important about it? Well, the first one a lot of people think of is one, just the looks of our pasture. We like it to be nice, pretty, even green. We don't want a whole lot of variation out there. And so just the kind of visual aspects of it is normally why people think of that. But on the aspects of our animals is it's going to reduce a lot of the grazing potential that you have in your pastures. So weeds compete with the desirable species that we have planted, whether that be our perennial grasses that we see in the summer or some cool season forages we've planted in the winter. And these weeds are often less palatable, sometimes less nutritious than the grasses that we've had. So your animals aren't going to be consuming them. It's going to give them the opportunity to seed out and spread and reduce grazing even more. You can see in this photo above where we have this thistle here that it's reducing a lot of grazing. This thistle was bigger than my whole foot. So, I mean, that's a few, square feet there of grazing that you've reduced. And that's going to reduce the amount of animals you can maintain on that pasture and just long-term grazability. So when we're grazing animals, the main thing that we want is forage production so we can stock, particularly in business-oriented situations, stock more animals, feed more animals. Secondly, some of these weeds can be toxic to our animals, and we want to make sure that we're removing those from any type of situation where we have animals present. So we're not inducing any signs or symptoms of toxicity in our animals, which in some cases can lead to death, but in more cases leads to production issues, weight loss, other illnesses. And in horses, we can see a lot of performance issues as well with toxic plants. And another line with that is some of these are invasive plants that can spread very rapidly, have damage to our ecosystem. And so we want to make sure we're being good stewards of the land and removing any of those invasive plants that could have a negative impact on our animals as well. So kind of my plug with pasture management is we always want to talk about soil testing. So even when we're managing pasture weeds, testing our soil is going to be incredibly important because we don't want to go out and start putting unnecessary amounts of fertilizer or lime out on our pasture, thinking that that's going to give our grass, the nutrients that it needs and get rid of the weeds. It's kind of a misnomer. So a lot of times you end up just feeding the weeds along with the grass. You might be spending some money on that fertilizer or lime that's unnecessary. It might not really be what you need. And so we want to make sure simultaneously while we're managing our pasture weeds that we're managing our soil as well. And so completing a soil test should be the first step in the process. Now is a great time to do that as we prepare for spring green up in March and April. And our grasses start coming up. We want to know exactly what our pastures are going to need to give them that best advantage while we're maintaining and managing those pasture weeds. So what are the two strategies that we can use to manage pasture weeds? The first one being herbicide treatments, and the second one being non-chemical strategies. So We'll talk a little bit about both and why we might choose one over the other, why we might use them simultaneously, and why they're both long-term management plans that we need to be aware of. So when we're working with herbicide treatments, the first thing that we need to do is work on some plant identification. And so identifying the weeds that we're battling is going to be critical to being able to treat them effectively with herbicides or even with non-chemical strategies, because we need to know whether herbicide intervention is going to be necessary and whether those non-chemical strategies will be enough to manage the weeds on their own. So identifying those plants is going to be critical. We can do this by identifying plant families. We can do it by identifying whether they're a woody species, a broadleaf species. All of those little tidbits will help us in getting to that herbicide selection. But if we can identify the specific species of plant that is, then that's going to be the best way to be able to choose the correct herbicide that's going to give you the best overall management of those weeds. So work with either your county extension agent. You can do some searching online. There's some phone apps that you can use that are helpful in identifying plants. But as an extension plug, I'm always going to recommend that you work with your county extension agent to help identify the weeds that you have. This is a free service available to you in every county in Florida. There's an extension service in every state in the country. So make sure that you're utilizing that resource in identifying those plants. Second, we need to determine the timing of when we're going to be able to apply that herbicide, what time of year we're looking at controlling the weeds. So we might have some different selections if it's summer or winter, and that'll help us with plant identification as well, because we have different weeds at different times of the year. But the different types of herbicides that we're gonna apply are going to be at the different times that weed is growing, or when your pasture is dormant or non-dormant. So we typically have three sections per se, where we're going to look at applying herbicides. This would be pre-emergence being before the weeds have actually shown up. So say we have issues with sand spurs or some of our other kind of more aggressive weeds that are difficult to control once they've already emerged, and we know we've had problems with them in the past, then we might apply a pre-emergence to prevent those weeds from even germinating and coming up. We can have some issues with that, and we'll talk a little bit about that when we go more into our herbicide specifics. When we're looking at dormant pastures, so here in Florida, most of our dormant pastures are going to be during the winter because we are a warm season perennial state. Typically, our pastures are planted in Bahia grass or Bermuda grass when we're grazing, and those two are both prevalent in the warm season summer. So dormancy period would be during the winter when that grass isn't producing and isn't growing. And so we are going to choose different herbicides based on that. We have a little more selections that we can do because your desirable species aren't going to be as actively taking up that herbicide and may not be as damaged depending on the herbicide that we're selecting. And then generally when people are looking at weed management is during the non-dormant season, so our production season, because usually in Florida, our highest weed issues are during the summer. And so that's, of course, going to be the same time that our pasture grass is growing. So that non-dormancy period is when we're really going to be looking at applying those herbicides. But knowing that timing is going to be important in your herbicide selection as well. And then the grass tolerance. So not all species, and even within the species, not all varieties are tolerant to the different selections of herbicide that we have available and the different classes and such related to that, the active ingredients. So we want to make sure that we're not just going to our local store and purchasing, any herbicide and thinking that that's going to apply. Because if you have a Bahia grass pasture, for say, and you choose some of the more aggressive herbicides that we have available, and you go and broadcast spray that across your pasture, you'll control the weeds, but you'll likely control your pasture grass as well. So we want to make sure that we're not doing anything that's going to negatively impact our desirable species in our pastures. So what are some of the techniques that we have to actually apply our herbicides. There are generally two physical techniques that we use, one of those being broadcast spray. So this is typically done in a bulk tank, so it's going to be a large volume, you know, a number of gallons, 50 gallons or so generally, or larger. And you're going to be working that on a boom sprayer. So it's going to be something that has multiple nozzles along it, and it's going to be spraying a large area. These can be pulled behind an ATV, they can be pulled behind a truck, or typically pulled behind a tractor in our larger operations. These are generally related with more herbicide costs because you're covering a large area, and you have larger equipment needs because you're going to need some type of mechanism to pull this sprayer. But it is going to afford you more herbicide coverage. So your equipment and labor costs, run time and such like that may be shorter than a method like spot spraying, which is an alternative method we can use. This is typically a smaller herbicide cost because you may only have you know, at most a 10-gallon backpack sprayer. And therefore, you know, the amount of herbicide that you're going to be mixing in that tank is going to be lower. Your smaller equipment needs and costs related to that, a backpack sprayer is significantly less expensive. I can buy a 2-gallon hand pump sprayer at Home Depot or store of that nature for, you know, $10, $15 than a pull behind broadcast sprayer with a boom, which, you know, maybe a few $100s. This is going to afford you a lot less coverage. So it's going to be a lot more manual labor. You're going to have to go out there and spread individual weeds. The largest, you know, spray width you might get out of a hand sprayer or spot spraying section, you know, could be a few feet. It's nothing like you're going to be covering, you know, 6 or 8 feet length and, you know, moving at the pace of 3 or 4 miles an hour on a vehicle. This is all going to be a lot more hand labor. And so if you're working a larger area, if you're hiring a crew or anything of that sort, it's going to require more labor on your part, potentially more labor costs. And then there is a third method that can be used in either broadcast spraying or spot spraying, which is tank mixes. And what this is doing is mixing chemicals, herbicides of different classes in order to provide a broader coverage of the weeds that we can control. And so some of this might be done to cover some woody species and broadleaf species, especially some of our harder to control species like blackberry and dog fennel. We can mix some other herbicides in there that give just kind of a little extra kick in our tank mixes to control those multiple species, particularly when we're looking at a pasture that needs a lot of renovation or has overgrown weeds that are going to be more difficult to control. So that's another method that we can look at. So don't feel like, you know, you just need to purchase one particular herbicide. There might be a tank mix out there for you that will work better to control your species. And that's why it's really important to work with an extension agent or someone who's knowledgeable on herbicides and not just kind of reading the back of the label, because some of them may not include that. And, you know, that research and prior knowledge that we have is going to be beneficial in getting the most control for you. So let's talk about some specific herbicides that we can apply to our pastures. These are going to be the most common ones. We'll go through a number of lists here, and just be aware that the first couple slides are Bahia grass pastures, and then the last slide is going to be about Bermuda grass pastures. So remember how we talked about different species and different varieties of grass are going to be tolerant to different types of herbicides. So make sure that we're not going out and applying something that's going to kill our pasture grass. So Bahia grass is probably, I don't want to say our least tolerant to herbicide, but it's typically one that we have a few herbicides that we cannot apply to Bahia grass pastures. And we'll talk about those when we get to the Bermuda grass section, but just be aware of that. If you have a Bahia grass pasture, that's really the one you need to be paying attention to what you're selecting. So the first one, the most common one we hear about typically is 2,4-D. That is an active ingredient that typically controls broadleaf weeds, which is obviously a huge class of weeds available. to us, and you can see here in each of the slides we'll have kind of a feature weed that might be common in our pastures. And so broadleaf weeds are pretty much any herbaceous plant that we have. Most weeds that we see in our pastures are considered a broadleaf weed, unless they're, woody species or such like our dog fennel and stuff. Something to be aware of with 2,4-D is there are different formulations to this active ingredient. And so we want to make sure that during the warmer weather, which is when you'll start to be doing the control after this course, is that we're using amine formulations of 2,4-D, and that will be listed on the label of the herbicide that you're purchasing. So just make sure that you're purchasing that specific ingredient. We also have aminopyralids. These are typically used for plants like tropical soda apple, horse nettle, plants in the nightshade family, and pigweed. And so a product you might be familiar with is Milestone. It has the active ingredient aminopyralid in it. And you can see our spotlight weed on this slide is pigweed. That's a common weed we see a lot in pastures. There's a variety of different types of pigweed, but aminopyralids are usually used to control those kind of harder to control plants in those families. There's also the option for a tank mix of aminopyralid and 2,4-D. They also sell products like Graze on Next, which these active ingredients are already mixed together. We see that product used a lot in Bermuda grass pastures. It has a really broad coverage, particularly in plants in the nightshade family, pigweeds and broadleaf weeds. And so it just has kind of a greater area of coverage of weed selection. And so the next couple herbicides we can use in Bermuda grass pastures are Outrider or Sandia, which are our sulfuron families of active ingredients. And these are really only used for sedges. So this is a particular species of plant. We see a lot in pastures that have water holding issues or wet areas, which if you're in my area in Baker County, we have pretty much the whole county is a wet area. And so we see a lot of issues with sedges in pastures. They can take over pretty much an entire area pretty quickly, and they don't allow for a lot of grass growth under them. And so they're very difficult to control, and we have particular herbicides that we use for those. And these are unfortunately very expensive herbicides. So we want to make sure that we're not utilizing those products for anything but sedges, because they won't offer much control for other species. We have herbicides like tricyclopyr ester. Remedy is a product that has this active ingredient, and these control herbaceous and woody species. Generally, this is an herbicide we would recommend for woody species like blackberry and dog fennel and such. And then we have another herbicide that we can use in a tank mix. Pasture Guard is generally the trade name for this. This is a tricyclopyr fluroxor mix, and this is kind of that extra kick that we need to control our woody species, especially when they've allowed to get some height on them. So like for our dog fennel is over 20 inches, it pretty much won't be controlled by anything but the addition of Pasture Guard. Generally, we see Pasture Guard and Graze on Next mixed together in a tank mix. And so the last one we have on our hay grass pastures is Decamba, which I don't see used very often for pasture weeds, but it is an option for us to have for broadleaf weeds. Some trade names you'll see for these are Banvol, Clarity, and Vanquish. I would say Banvol and Vanquish are probably more popular on the store shelves, and we see those offered more. But generally, you'll go more for the 2,4-D products for broadleaf weed control, just because it's a little more broad in its control and the amount of species that it controls than Dicamba is. There are some products like Weedmaster that offer a Dicamba and 2,4-D mix. You'll always see this offered in a 2,4-D amine formulation, which means this is something we'd be applying in the warm season. And this typically has more control than either dicamba or 2,4-D used alone, because again, it's just going to offer a more broad spectrum control of different weed species. So if you have a pasture that's just infested with a variety of amount of weeds, then this option might be better for you than using either alone. And lastly, glyphosate is an option in Bahia grass pastures, but only using the spot spray method. So we would never want to broadcast spray glyphosate, even at a weak formulation, on our Bahia grass pastures, because Bahia grass is extremely susceptible to glyphosate. And pretty much any Bahia grass that gets sprayed with glyphosate will be killed. So if we have some of our really hard weeds that we need to control, we're not being able to control them with other herbicides and other ingredients, then glyphosate is an option only in a spot spray method, knowing that we're going to lose some Bahia grass in the surrounding area. So like I said, Bahia grass is a little less tolerant to some of our different ingredients in herbicides, but Bermuda grass, we have a little bit more of an option. So if you have Bermuda grass pastures, then you can use all of the above herbicide ingredients that we just discussed. You also have two other options, which is methylfuron. This is typically offered in the MSM60 trade name. There's also a few other trade names that methylfuron is an active ingredient in, but when you're looking at products, MSM60 is a good one to take a look at for that example. Typically, this is used in the cool season, and so the dormant season of our pastures, but we can use it in early spring as well for our Bermuda grass pastures that are coming out of dormancy, and somewhat can be used in the summer, but you'll see limited control in this. We see this used a lot in hayfields because it does control Bahia grass in our Bermuda grass pastures. And so again, you should understand that if it's controlling Bahia grass, it's killing Bahia grass, and that's why we would not want to use that in our Bahia grass pastures. Glyphosate is an option for some of our harder to control annual grasses. In Bermuda grass pastures, we can do a higher mix, so to 1 to 3% mix of glyphosate in water in a spot spray. And for some of our harder to control perennial grasses that we might find in Bermuda grass pastures, knowing that we might see some stunting or loss in our Bermuda grass surrounding that area, but glyphosate at a weaker tank mix is able to apply as a broadcast spray to Bermuda grass pastures for some of our annual grass mixes. And sometimes we see this in a wiping method as well, which is a special type of boom sprayer, which allows us to wipe the top of the weeds with a cloth that has a continual flow of herbicide to it. And that can reduce some of the damage to our Bermuda grass pastures. And in some cases, we can use that in Bahia grass pastures as well, but we have to be really careful in that situation. So if you guys are available, I'm going to initiate a poll here about pesticides just to see what you guys know. And I will give you a few seconds to vote on that. So the question here is if pesticide labels are a legal document that you must abide by. We'll give about 5 more seconds. All right, perfect. So most of you guys got that right, that yes, pesticide labels are a legal document. They are legally binding that you automatically agree to when you purchase and utilize that product. So make sure any herbicide that you're going out and purchasing, a lot of people feel like because some pesticides are regulated, meaning that you are required to have a license by the state of Florida or your respective state to purchase those products and apply those products. But most of the products that we just talked about in pretty much all situations are not regulated active ingredients, and therefore anybody can go to Tractor Supply, Home Depot, any of our local feed stores and purchase these products and apply them. And if they have no knowledge or such, and they are right next to a crop farmer and they go and spray all of these herbicides and it kills all the crops next door or something, you are legally liable for that because you did not read the label regulations. So make sure that we're paying attention to two main things for our own personal pastures, but which are the application rates and the grazing or cutting restrictions. And we'll talk a little bit more about those, but in general, the labels on your herbicides are law. You need to go and make sure that you are reading those labels extensively. The full labels are often available online even before you purchase the product. So this will also give you a lot of recommendations to what weed species it controls, when you can apply it, what rate you should apply it, and such. And so application rates is going to be really important because that's going to tell you every product is a little bit different based on like the university. We can give you recommendations and it's usually a range of what your application rate should be. So, whether you're applying at 1 quart an acre or, 0.1 pints an acre or 2% solution and such like that. It's going to vary a little bit based on the product that you purchase because all of them are going to have different amounts of that active ingredient in their product. And so we want to make sure that we're looking at the label regulations first and determining whether, what's going to be the best application rate for us. And your rate's going to vary based on whether you're broadcast spraying or spot spraying as well. And then some of these ingredients have a limit on how much you can apply per acre per year. So we want to make sure that we're adhering to any of those limits as well. Some of them are pretty small, so we don't want to go over those limits. And then some products do have grazing and cutting restrictions. This is really important if you are grazing food animals or intend to harvest any of your animals or sell them to anyone else because they need to be made aware of these restrictions. So some of them may have a 40-day grazing restriction, which that doesn't mean that you can't go and graze that animal for 40 days, but that means that any animal that has grazed on that pasture cannot be sold for, in the food production system for at least 40 days after the application. And some of them may have some various ones. Some products like Graze on Next in particular do transmit through the body of the animal and are present in the manure. And so we want to make sure that we're not removing that manure. I see this a lot in equine facilities and such where they may be composting that or giving that away as manure for garden beds and such, trying to get rid of that manure. But if they've been grazing on Graze on Next treated pastures, that Graze on Next is still present in the manure and can kill pretty much any plant that someone's going to put in a vegetable garden with that kind of compost or anything of that sort. So make sure we're reading those labels and paying attention to those instances. Okay, I've got one last poll for you here. And I would like you to tell me what height Bahia grass pastures should be grazed to. So this could be what you think into continuous stocking, rotational grazing, just kind of what the average height you think is. We'll give about 30 seconds for this. All right, perfect. So we had kind of a half and half. And so this one's a little more difficult because this is the minimum height. And so typically with rotational stocking, we can recommend that Bahia grass should be grazed no shorter than 3 inches. If it's a continuous stocking, and so those animals never come off that pasture, then generally we'd like a stocking rate that doesn't make that grass go shorter than 5 inches. Often we don't see that, but typically we like to stay between that 3 and 6 inch range for Bahia grass. So kind of all the answers were right. I'd just like to see kind of what your general idea is. And so a lot of people chose 4 inches, and typically we do see that 4 to 6 inch range advertised a lot. But Bahia grass pastures in general should be Mowed or grazed no shorter than 3 inches. If you're cutting for hay, then they can be cut as short as 2 inches. But hay is a little different because you're going to be, drastically fertilizing and promoting the growth of that. So besides herbicides, we have a few non-chemical strategies that we can use for pasture management. This would be rotational grazing, and allowing those rest periods between grazing events is going to be really important to allowing your grass to come back from the trauma per se of grazing, and really increases the competitiveness of those pasture grasses to be able to overtake any of the weeds that might be present in your pastures. Mowing can be really beneficial if we're trying to steer away from spraying herbicides. Maybe we're in an organic situation, or we just don't really like the use of chemicals, or whatever your reasoning may be. Expense could be an option as well, or it's a difficult area to access. Mowing can be really beneficial. It helps promote that new growth of our pasture grasses, which is when they're really going to be producing. That's the great palatable and nutritious aspect we want our animals to be grazing on. And we're going to be getting rid of those annual species of weeds that are coming up year after they're new seeds coming up every year. So we want to make sure that we're mowing before that seed head production, and over time, over the years, this will reduce the amount of seeds that are in our soil that are then germinating and producing plants that we're competing with. Planting desirable annuals in the cool season can be really important as well, because one, it reduces the likeliness that our animals are overgrazing our warm season perennial grasses like our Bahia and Bermuda, because if they're on there during the winter, they're going to be grazing, they're going to be cutting that grass shorter and shorter, and then in the dormant period, that grass isn't producing anything else. So you're likely overgrazing if you're not planting cool season forages. That can also help use some of our nutrients and such in the soil and compete with the weed species, so they can't even get started. But your perennial grasses that already have an established root structure and such will be able to come up, and so you're kind of mitigating those weed species from the very beginning. And if you're having a lot of weed issues currently, and you have a lot of barren areas, we see this a lot in horse pastures because horses are very difficult on pastures, then it might be a need to reseed. And reseeding can help fill in some of those areas where we see issues with weeds because there is no competition from our pasture grasses there. And so this can be an option for a quick fix, but it is quite expensive, so we want to be cautious with that. So how do we determine what's going to be the most effective method for us, whether we're going to use herbicide control or non-chemical control? The first thing are, what are your timing goals? Do you need a quick fix? Are you purchasing animals? Do you already have too many animals for your pasture? Are you looking for a total renovation, or are you looking for more of a long-term management plan? So herbicides can be a nice quick fix for us. It's going to go out, it's going to kill those weeds relatively quickly, but it may not do anything for our weeds necessarily next year, or we may still have issues with overgrazing, things like that. So make sure, when you're discussing your pasture weed management issues with your extension agent or with your operational manager, that we're looking at what are our timing goals for controlling these weeds. Our financial goals. So herbicide application can be expensive. Some of our products like 2,4-D are relatively cheap at only $5 or so an acre, but some of them, more of our difficult to control species, can be in upwards of $40 an acre. Plus the time and equipment to run that, the cost associated with that, and especially if you're having to hire a crew, if you have a larger operation, then it can get up there pretty fast. Reseeding can be expensive, so even with cheap Pensacola Bahia, we're looking at over $60 an acre, plus the time to spread that and manage that, fertilize it and such, and the equipment and labor required with that. And then some financial goals of whether feeding hay is going to be a cheaper, more economical solution than planting cool season annuals, and how does that incorporate into our pasture weed management, as well as just our financial goals for our operation. And then your labor goals. You really have to be realistic with yourself on how much time and energy you truly want to put into managing your pasture. So if you're like me, sometimes you can be really lazy, and I don't want to go out when it's 900 degrees outside in Florida summer and I'll be out there spot spraying weeds or managing my weeds. And so some of my management plan may be a little longer term, knowing that I'm going to focus on mowing and weed management in the fall and spring when it's cooler and it's nicer to be outside and it's easier to manage those kind of stuff and get ahead of it than I am going to worry about a whole lot of weed control in the dead of summer or so. Be realistic of what time and materials and equipment and stuff you have available and plan accordingly. And so I want to spend kind of this last 5 or 10 minutes and just a little bit of a Q&A session. And if you guys have any particular questions regarding your pastures, we can look at some specific documents to talk about some weed control available to you.